So we're thinking about faithful to the end. That's the title, and it's about God's faithfulness. The verse I've got is Deuteronomy chapter 31, verse 6, and this is what it says. Be strong and brave, and don't tremble in fear of them, because the eternal, your God, is going with you. He'll never fail you or abandon you. Our God is faithful. Our God doesn't break his promises. Our God is always there with us, never abandons us. This is our God. Thank you very much for joining in my question about your favourite songs, unfaithfulness, about unfaithfulness and about faithfulness. Here's the list. As you can see, 10 people responded. I've got 10 responses about faithfulness and 8 about unfaithfulness. Those songs about unfaithfulness are a dreadful list of songs about lying and cheating, about having to delve deep into that whole thing of having to confess your sins because you know you've made a right mess up of things. Regrets, other people talking about how they just have felt so wounded and so hurt by what's been done to them. Sad list. Now, then you've got the faithful songs, and the thing about the list of faithful songs is that 8 of those are worship songs. So they're not about people at all. They're directed entirely towards God. God is faithful. One of them, the Whitney Houston song, I think is speaking to God as well. So that leaves just one song that is really written about human faithfulness. I hope that's not a true reflection. I'm sure there must be other songs out there about faithfulness. But what is certain is that we all know what it is to experience being let down. We all know what unfaithfulness is, whether that's within our families, whether that's with romance, as in these songs. People have claimed they love us and they clearly don't. Whether it's about our workplace and how we get let down there, whether it's about neighbours or friends, supposed friends, whether it's things we buy and sell. People get cheated all the time out of money by people who lie to them, and people think this is going to be their way forward, and they find they lose all their money. Whether it's politicians, we just want people to speak the truth to us and stick to the truth and stick beside us and keep things moving forward, don't we? But we experience unfaithfulness all the time from other people in different ways. And the trouble with that is that we start to put up our defences and we become guarded. We cease to be able to trust anybody. We cease to believe what anybody ever says. And we're always trying to find out, why should I believe you? Why should I trust you? Why should I think that you're going to be faithful to the things you're saying and to what you're promising me? Why? Now, I hope that all of us have experienced some wonderful experiences of people who've been faithful to us, people who stand beside us, people we can really trust, and I hope that's true for all of us. But what is true is, because we've experienced the pain of people who've been unfaithful, because we've become guarded, that can mean that we find it harder to trust anybody. We become more turned in on ourselves, saying, I'm just going to trust me, I'm not going to trust anybody else. And the real problem of that is eventually we say, and that includes God. I don't know if I can really trust God. When God calls us to trust him, we say, I'm not used to trusting anybody. Why should I trust you? So let's go to this story we've got today, which is from Deuteronomy chapter 31. Why did the children of Israel back in those days, those ancient Jews, why did they need to trust God at that point? Well, this is the last speech of Moses. Deuteronomy is basically the last speech of Moses to his people. Moses is the leader who went up against Pharaoh and ended up bringing those people out of slavery into freedom. Moses is the leader who led them through the Red Sea. Do you remember that story when the seas part and they can walk right through on dry land and get away from the armies that are chasing them, and then the seas come back and drown those armies, so they're safe, they're off and they're free. Moses is the leader who led them around for 40 years in that desert wandering. And in that period, he was the one who, under God's direction, helped them find water. He was the one who helped them find food, kept them alive. And most importantly, Moses is the leader who, under God's direction, turned this rabble of runaway slaves into a nation and a really lean, mean, powerful fighting force. He did all that. And here is his last speech. And right here, he's saying to them, you're on the brink, folks, of the biggest step in this whole journey of going into that promised land. And I've got a little announcement for you. You're going to take on the biggest risk you've ever taken on. And I've got a little announcement for you. The announcement is this. I'm getting old. 120 he was. Wow, pretty good going, isn't it? 120. He said, I'm not going to cross the Jordan with you into that land. I'm not going to be your leader. Joshua, this new leader, he will lead you. And there's something else you should know, that actually in that land there, they've got walled cities. They've got more people than we've got. They've got a bigger and a better equipped army than we've got. You could get wiped out, but I want you to go in there, and I want you to be brave, and I want you to be strong, and I want you to be courageous. I want you to trust God. And I don't think it's wholly surprising that the people should say back to Moses, well, why should we trust God? Why on earth should we trust? Why should we not fear? We've got every reason to fear. And here's Moses' reply. This is what Moses would say in reply. He would say, you shouldn't fear, because it's not about me. It's not about Joshua, the new leader. It's not even about you. It's all about God. He is bigger than me. He is bigger than Joshua. He's bigger than us as a nation. He's bigger than all our enemies. God is more powerful, and he will be with you, and he will be beside you, and he will never leave you. And that's why you should be bold and courageous, and that's why you shouldn't fear, because God is with you. You think it's me. It was God who went up against Pharaoh and got you out. No man could do that. It was God who parted the Red Sea. No man could do that. It was God who found you water and food in the desert. No man can do that. It was God who gave us his wonderful laws and commands and shaped us into this nation that we are now. This was God's doing. You have seen God working. You have seen God working. Now trust him into the future. And if they don't trust God, they're going to be either stuck on this side of the River Jordan in the desert, or they've got to go back to Egypt into slavery. On the other hand, if they do trust God, they can cross that Jordan River and they can go into the land that God's promised them, where they can settle down and have homes and have their fields and have their vineyards and have a life of peace. You see, not trusting God has consequences, and trusting God has consequences. And it's exactly the same for us. If we trust God, it will have consequences in our lives, and if we don't trust God, it will have consequences in our lives. That's just the way it is. So why should you and I trust God? Well, number one reason, we've got these stories you've just read. We've got all the stories in the Bible, haven't we? All those wonderful stories about how God acted throughout history and was so faithful to his people. And indeed, his people still exist today. But we've got two other factors, not just all those stories there of what God did with Israel, but we have two other factors. We've got, first of all, we have something they didn't have, which is we know about Jesus. We have the stories of Jesus. Let me read you what the Apostle Paul said about Jesus and what that should mean to us in trusting God. This is what he said. So this is Romans chapter 8, verse 31 to 32. What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? what Paul is saying here is, if God has given us the most precious thing he could give us, his own son, if he's that committed to you and to me, if he loves you and me that much, if he's willing to pay that sort of price to make you and me safe and bring you and me into God's family, he's not going to leave me. He's not going to abandon me. He's invested far too much in me, and he's proved himself far too much. Because I've got the story of Christmas, of Jesus coming to this earth and walking amongst us, because I've got the story of Easter, of Jesus dying, I know that God will never leave me and will never abandon me, and he'll never leave you and he'll never abandon you. But we've got another thing as well. We've got the whole story of how God has been faithful to his church right down the ages, and that includes you and me now. God has always been faithful. It doesn't matter where you go in history, what period, what group of Christians you read about, you will find that God has been faithful and stood with them. I've got my own stories. I've got a whole bunch of stories. If I was to tell you one story, I guess one of the most dramatic in my time in Headington was when we were wanting to rebuild our church up there on the old high street. Some of you have seen it, some of you have been in it. And when we put the final plans in to get planning permission, the planning officer said, no, I don't want you to build this building. The conservation officer for that area said, no, we don't want to build this building. No plan that had gone to the planning committee of the city council, when the planning officer has said no, and when the conservation officer has said no, no other plan had ever been passed. Our likelihood of getting that plan through, humanly, there was no history of anybody having got that through. But we got through. We got through. I can remember the phone call coming through. I couldn't be at the meeting. I was at home. I was taking another meeting. And Marion picked up the phone and she said, James, they phoned through with the result. And she tried to tease me. She said, James, I've got bad news for you. But I could see in her face that we had been given permission to build that building. And I couldn't speak. I could not speak. It was so emotional because I knew God had been faithful. And he'd carried us through because we'd stepped out in faith, and he'd carried us through. We've got that beautiful building that we've been able to use to serve God and to serve the community in his name. Praise God. Okay, so that's the call today. The call is for us to be strong, to be full of courage, not to fear, but to trust that God will go with us. And I want us to go into breakout groups and think about some questions.